the painting that showed who I would become. Have you ever stared at something so long that it started staring back? Not metaphorically, literally. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't a ghost story or a fever dream. It's the truth about what happens when art stops being observation and becomes prophecy. And if you're still watching this, it means you're brave enough to see what I saw. But I'll warn you now, some truths change you just by knowing them. I've always believed that every painting is a form of truth. Some artists chase beauty, some chase chaos. I've always chased accuracy, an almost obsessive need to capture a person's essence with a precision that goes beyond technique. Clients used to joke that I painted souls, not faces, but that was before I understood what a terrible responsibility that actually was. Before I understood that sometimes, when you stare into someone long enough, something else stares back. My name is Elias Ward, and I need you to believe me when I say this. The painting changed before my eyes, and it showed someone I have not yet become. The patron who should not have existed. The story begins on a wet, metallic Tuesday in November. The kind of day where the sky looks rubbed out like charcoal smudged by a careless hand. My studio smelled of turpentine, linseed oil, and old wood, the warm, familiar scent of my life that had surrounded me for the past 15 years. Rain hammered against the tall windows, creating a rhythm that had lulled me into a meditative state as I cleaned my brushes, watching the water run dark with pigment in the porcelain sink. I had just finished rinsing the last brush when the bell downstairs chimed. Out of habit, I ignored it. People wandered into my shop all the time, tourists mostly, thinking I sold prints or postcards, unaware that every piece on these walls was an original, commissioned work worth more than most people's cars. But the bell rang again, sharper this time, cutting through the rain's percussion like a knife through silk. "Mr. Ward," a voice like brushed velvet, smooth and wrong in equal measure. I descended the narrow wooden steps, each creak familiar under my feet after years of the same journey up and down, and instantly froze at the bottom. A man stood in the center of my gallery, positioned perfectly beneath the skylight where rain drummed overhead. Tall, impossibly tall, at least 6.5 feet. Lean in a way that didn't look weak, but precise, like each bone had been measured and chosen for symmetry. His suit was outdated, yet immaculate, the kind you'd see in photographs from the 1920s, with peaked lapels and a high collar, perfectly pressed despite the storm outside. But his appearance wasn't what made my breath catch and lodge somewhere between my lungs and throat. It was his skin, pale, almost translucent, like paper stretched over moonlight. Veins traced delicate blue patterns beneath the surface, creating an effect that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling, like looking at a medical illustration come to life. And then there were his eyes. They were the same color as raw canvas, not white, not cream, but that specific shade of unprimed linen before the first layer of gesso. Blank, absorbing, waiting to be marked with purpose. "I need a portrait," he said without preamble, his voice carrying easily despite speaking barely above a whisper. "One unlike any you've made." I stammered, trying to find my professional voice beneath the unease crawling up my spine. "Appointments are usually scheduled weeks in advance. I have a waiting list of nearly 3 months right now. I'm booked through February." "I know," he interrupted smoothly, his lips barely moving, "but you'll want to take this one." He moved forward with a fluidity that seemed fundamentally wrong somehow, as if he were gliding rather than walking, his feet making absolutely no sound on the wooden floor that creaked under everyone else's weight. From inside his coat, he produced something, a folded square of parchment, yellowed with age, the edges crispy and delicate. When I opened it with trembling fingers, my heart thudded violently against my ribs, a physical blow from inside my own chest. It was a symbol. A spiral surrounding an eye, enclosed by jagged geometric shapes, something between sacred geometry and a warning scratched by a terrified hand. The lines were impossibly sharp, as if etched by something that wasn't human, each angle perfect despite the age of the document. The ink looked old, possibly centuries old, but the paper showed no signs of the deterioration it should have suffered. "You've seen this before," he said. Not a question, a statement of absolute fact. My throat tightened until breathing became a conscious effort. I had seen it, once. In a dream I swore I'd forgotten, a nightmare from when I was 7 years old that had haunted me for weeks before fading into the murky waters of repressed memory. In that dream, the symbol had been carved into black stone, glowing with a sickly phosphorescent light that hurt to look at directly, while voices whispered in languages I didn't understand, but somehow knew were ancient beyond human comprehension. I'd woken up screaming. My mother had held me for hours, telling me it was just a bad dream, that symbols in nightmares couldn't hurt me. She'd been wrong about that last part. How did you? I couldn't finish the sentence. My tongue felt thick and clumsy. I need the portrait, he repeated softly, his canvas-colored eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl and tighten. And you are going to paint it. I should have told him to leave. I should have called the police. I should have burned that parchment and salted the ashes. I should have run as far and as fast as my legs could carry me. But something about him, or perhaps the symbol itself, wouldn't let me. It was as if an invisible thread had been tied around my will, pulling me toward a decision I didn't want to make but couldn't resist. Fine, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rain battering the windows. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Bring a deposit and we'll discuss. He shook his head slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth like a secret he was enjoying alone. No, midnight. Midnight? That's absurd. I don't work at night. The light is all wrong and I have a process. Midnight, Mr. Ward. Tonight. The lights in the gallery flickered, just once, but it was enough to send a chill racing down my spine like ice water poured straight into my nervous system. Before I could protest further, he turned and walked toward the door, his movements unnaturally smooth, each step flowing into the next without the slight hesitations that mark human movement. His footsteps made no sound on the wooden floor that announced every visitor. Wait, I called after him, finding my voice. I don't even know your name. How will I invoice you? How will... He paused at the threshold, rain streaming down beyond him like a curtain of silver beads in the streetlight. Without turning, without looking back, he spoke. Names are temporary things, Mr. Ward. Faces are forever. Then he was gone, swallowed by the storm as if he'd never existed at all. I stood alone in my gallery, the parchment still clutched in my trembling hand, staring at the symbol that shouldn't exist outside my childhood nightmares. The rain continued to fall, drumming its relentless rhythm. But inside my chest, something had shifted, a weight settling into place, like a key turning in a lock I didn't know existed, opening a door I'd never seen before. I looked down at the symbol again. In the dim gallery light, I could swear the lines were moving, writhing slowly like worms beneath glass. I blinked hard, and they were still again, just old ink on old paper, nothing more, nothing more. I tried to believe that, the first brushstroke. He arrived precisely at midnight, not 11:59, not 12:01, exactly midnight, as if he'd been waiting outside in the rain, watching a clock with inhuman patience, counting down the seconds until the appointed moment. I'd spent the hours since his departure trying to convince myself not to do this. I'd paced my studio until I'd worn a path in the old rug, argued with myself in increasingly desperate tones, even picked up my phone a dozen times to call someone, anyone, but who would believe me? My sister. She already thought I spent too much time alone. My few friends? They'd laugh or recommend a therapist. What would I even say? A strange man showed me a symbol from my childhood nightmares, and now I'm painting him at midnight because I'm apparently losing my mind and all sense of self-preservation? No, some choices, once made, become inevitable. Some doors once opened can't be closed again. I'd said yes. The thread had been tied. Now I had to see where it led, even if every instinct screamed at me to cut it and run. When the clock in my studio struck 12, its chimes seeming louder than they'd ever been before, I heard no footsteps on the stairs, no bell, no knock, no announcement of arrival. He was simply there, standing in the center of my studio, as if he'd materialized from the shadows themselves, condensing out of darkness like fog becoming solid. You came, I said unnecessarily, my voice rough from hours of not speaking. Did you doubt I would? His tone suggested my doubt would have been offensive. I gestured to the chair I'd positioned near my easel, having spent far too long deciding on the exact angle, the precise placement of the lamps. Sit there. The light is best from this position. He sat with perfect stillness, like a statue carved from breathless marble by a sculptor who'd forgotten that humans need to breathe, to blink, to make those tiny adjustments that keep blood flowing and muscles from cramping. No fidgeting, no blinking, no human micro-movements that betray life and consciousness. It was as if he'd turned himself off, becoming nothing more than a three-dimensional reference photograph, an object rather than a person. I adjusted my easel, checked the canvas one more time, a large piece, 30 by 40 inches, prepared with 3 coats of gesso that had taken days to properly dry and sand. I lit the oil lamps. I'd chosen them over electric lights for their warmer glow, and because something told me this painting required traditional methods, old ways, techniques that predated electricity and modern convenience. I began preparing my charcoal for the initial sketch, my hands moving through familiar motions, finding comfort in routine, even as my nerves jangled with warning signals that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. The ritual of preparation calmed me, selecting the right grade of charcoal, testing it on scrap paper, checking the texture, the darkness, the way it glided. But the moment my charcoal touched canvas, everything changed. The room grew colder. Not gradually, not the slow creep of winter through old windows, but instantly, as if someone had opened a door directly to the Arctic. The temperature dropped so sharply I could see my breath misting in front of my face, each exhalation becoming visible, tangible. The lights dimmed, their flames shrinking despite no apparent draft, as if something were sucking the energy directly from the fire itself. "Are you doing that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady and failing miserably. "I'm doing nothing," he replied calmly, his voice unchanged by the cold that had me shivering. "Just sit, paint." A low hum began, like vibrations inside wood, the kind of sound you feel more than hear, running through the floorboards and up through the legs of my stool. It reminded me of the sound old pipes make in winter when water rushes through them, but deeper, more resonant, as if the building itself were beginning to sing in a frequency just below human hearing, but perfectly audible to something older than humanity. I forced myself to focus on the work, pushing aside the fear trying to paralyze my hands. I mapped the planes of his face, the sharp architecture of cheekbones that looked carved from marble, the severe jawline that appeared constructed rather than grown, the way shadows pooled in the hollows of his temples. But the longer I worked, the heavier the air became, as if the room itself was inhaling, drawing atmosphere into some invisible lung, building pressure for an exhalation that might blow everything apart. Somewhere between the third and fourth stroke, I felt it, a presence settling behind my shoulder. Not touching, not breathing, but there, watching with an attention so focused it felt like gravity, like weight pressing down on me, bending space around its observation. My hand trembled. The charcoal line wavered, broke. "Steady," the man said softly, his voice cutting through my rising panic. "You must be precise." I swallowed hard and continued, trying to ignore the presence behind me, trying to pretend it was just my imagination, just stress and fear manifesting as sensation. But something had changed in my perception. I wasn't just drawing his face anymore. I was drawing through it, as if my eyes could penetrate the mask of skin and bone to see what lay beneath. And what I saw, no, what I felt, there was something underneath him. Something vast and dark and patient, coiled like a serpent that had been waiting for centuries, for millennia, for the exact right moment to strike. Something that wore him like a suit, like a costume, like a mask covering its true face. My wrist moved in ways I didn't quite intend, guided by that unseen gravity pressing down on my shoulder. Lines appeared on the canvas that I didn't remember planning, couldn't remember deciding to make. Shadows deepened in places where light should have been. The background grew darker than I'd intended, as if I were painting not a room but a void, an absence, a hole in reality itself. "You see it, don't you?" His voice cut through my concentration like a blade through silk. My breath hitched, caught somewhere between my lungs and throat. "See what?" The truth beneath the skin. I dropped the charcoal. It clattered against the floor, the sound impossibly loud, rolling into darkness beyond the lamplight where I couldn't see it anymore, couldn't retrieve it, couldn't take back what I'd already drawn. "How the hell do you know what I see?" My voice rose, cracking with fear and anger and confusion. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His canvas-colored eyes held knowledge that predated language, predated humanity, predated the world as we understood it. With shaking hands, I looked down at my sketch. My blood turned to ice in my veins, freezing me from the inside out. I had drawn his face perfectly. Every line, every shadow, every subtle detail captured with the precision I was known for, the accuracy that had built my reputation. But behind him, emerging from the background like a ghost developing on photographic paper, like something rising from deep water to break the surface, was a second figure. Tall, dark, its outline indistinct, as if it existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, as if I were seeing only the three-dimensional cross-section of something far more complex. Featureless, except for its eyes. And those eyes, they were mine, not similar to mine, not reminiscent. They were my exact eyes, copied with impossible accuracy, every fleck of color, every tiny blood vessel, every reflection duplicated perfectly. They stared out from that shadow figure with an expression I'd never worn, never felt, never imagined on my own face. Hungry, knowing, almost amused, as if it found this entire situation entertaining. "No," I whispered, backing away from the easel until my legs hit the edge of a table. "No, that's not. I didn't draw that. I couldn't have. I wouldn't have. But you did." He stood smoothly, his movement making no sound, defying the physics of chairs and weight and balance, and approached the canvas. He studied it with clinical fascination, his head tilting in a way that seemed to involve more vertebrae than a human spine should possess, bending at angles that made my stomach turn. "That face behind me," he murmured, reaching toward the canvas but not quite touching it, his pale finger hovering an inch from the surface. "Those eyes, that presence, that shadow, that is you." "I didn't draw." "You did," he repeated more firmly, his tone carrying absolute certainty. "Because you saw. You always see. That is your gift, Mr. Ward, the reason I chose you out of all the thousands of artists in this city, in this country, in this world." "I don't understand." My voice cracked on the last word, breaking like glass under pressure. He turned to face me fully, and for the first time since he'd entered my studio, his expression changed. The blank mask slipped just slightly, revealing something that might have been pity or might have been satisfaction. I couldn't tell which, couldn't read it, couldn't understand what I was seeing in those canvas-colored eyes. "You painted the version of you that is coming," he said simply, as if this explained everything, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. I backed away until my spine hit the wall, the cold plaster pressing through my shirt. "That's insane. That's impossible." Is it?" He tilted his head again, studying me the way a scientist might study a specimen under glass, curious but detached. "Tell me, Elias, have your paintings ever been wrong? Has your perception ever failed you? When you paint someone, do you not capture something essential, something that goes beyond mere physical appearance?" My mouth had gone completely dry. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. Because he was right. Every portrait I'd ever completed had been praised for capturing something ineffable about the subject. Their soul, as clients like to say, with tears in their eyes. Their essential nature. The truth of who they were beneath the masks they wore for the world. But I'd always thought that was just artistic skill. Years of observation, technical excellence, practice and dedication and natural talent combining into something special but entirely explainable. I'd never considered it might be something else, something more, something I didn't understand and couldn't control, some gift or curse I'd been born with and never recognized. "You paint what others cannot yet know," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing me to strain to hear over my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. "You see the truth of people, not who they are now, not who they pretend to be, but who they truly are, their potential, their destiny, their fate written in flesh and bone." He leaned forward slightly, and I smelled something strange, not decay, not death, but absence, like the smell of a room that hasn't been opened in centuries. "That is your gift," he said, "and your curse." The lamps flickered violently, their flames dancing as if caught in a wind that didn't exist, casting wild shadows across the walls that writhed and twisted into shapes that looked almost intentional, almost alive, almost trying to form words or warnings. When the lights steadied, the man was already at the door. I hadn't seen him move. One moment he was in front of the canvas, close enough to touch. The next he was at the threshold 20 feet away, his hand on the doorframe, his body half turned toward the darkness beyond. "We are not finished," he said softly, not looking back at me, his voice carrying despite being directed away. "You must complete the painting before the week ends. 7 days, Mr. Ward. No more, no less." "Why?" I managed to choke out through the fear clamping around my throat. "Why me? Why this? Why any of this?" He paused, his silhouette outlined by the darkness beyond, rain still falling somewhere in the distance, the storm that had never quite ended. "Because if you don't complete it," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made the words feel like physical objects dropped into my chest, "the version of you on that canvas will complete itself. And when it does, when it finishes becoming, it will take your place in this world. And you will take its place in the canvas, forever." The door clicked shut behind him, the sound impossibly loud in the sudden silence, echoing like a gunshot or a verdict or a grave closing. I stood alone in my studio, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips, in my teeth, in every cell of my body, staring at the incomplete portrait that now held a figure wearing my eyes. The shadow me, the future me, the me that was coming. The temperature slowly began to normalize, warmth creeping back into the room degree by reluctant degree. The humming in the floorboards faded, sinking back into whatever depths it had risen from. The lamps burned steady and bright once more, their flames calm and controlled. Everything returned to normal. My studio looked exactly as it always had, familiar, safe, mine. Except for one thing. As I stood there, frozen with terror and fascination, unable to move or think or breathe properly, watching the canvas in the lamplight, the painted version of me smiled, just a slight upturn of the lips, barely visible, but unmistakable to someone who knew his own face, who'd seen it in mirrors and photographs for 37 years. I hadn't painted that smile. I was absolutely certain I hadn't. I remembered every stroke I'd made, and none of them had formed that expression. But there it was, clear as day, undeniable. And as I stared at it, transfixed, unable to look away despite every instinct screaming at me to run, to leave, to burn the building down and never look back, a terrible certainty settled into my bones like ice. The painting was alive, and it was waiting. The night the canvas breathed. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smile, my smile. But not mine. Different, wrong, hungry. I'd tried covering the canvas with a sheet, but that somehow made it worse. Knowing it was there, hidden, changing where I couldn't see it. At least with it exposed, I could watch it, guard against it, make sure it stayed paint and canvas and nothing more. Dawn came gray and reluctant, the sun barely managing to pierce the clouds that had settled over the city like a lid on a pot. I'd spent the entire night sitting in a chair across from the painting, watching for movement, for change, for any sign that what I'd seen was real and not exhaustion-induced hallucination. The shadow figure hadn't moved. The smile remained. Everything stayed exactly as it had been at 12:47 a.m. when I'd first noticed the expression that shouldn't exist. But I felt it watching me. All night. Every second. Those painted eyes, my eyes, tracking me even though they never moved, locked onto me with a tension that went beyond the normal optical illusion of portraits seeming to follow viewers. This was different. This was real. When morning came, I forced myself to look away, to make coffee, to pretend I was a normal person, living a normal life, doing normal things. But my hands shook so badly, I spilled grounds all over the counter, and when the machine finished brewing, the coffee tasted like ash and copper. I tried calling in sick to my only appointment that day, a final sitting with a client whose portrait was nearly complete. But she didn't answer, and I couldn't leave a voicemail because what would I say? "Sorry, can't finish your painting because I've started a different one that might be alive." So I worked on her portrait for 3 hours, forcing my hands to steadiness, forcing my mind to focus on technique and accuracy and all the normal things that usually brought me peace. But I felt it the entire time. The other canvas, behind me, watching. At 2 p.m., the client left happy with the finished work, paid the remainder of her commission, and departed with promises to recommend me to all her wealthy friends. I barely heard her. The moment she was gone, I turned back to his portrait. It had changed. Not much, not dramatically, but enough to stop my heart. The shadow figure standing behind the man, the version of me, had shifted slightly forward. Before, it had been a faint, ghost-like outline barely distinguishable from background shadow. Now its shoulders were sharper, more defined, its posture clearer, more solid, more present, the edges more certain, and the eyes, my eyes, looked more focused now, more alive, more aware, as if it had awakened something during the hours I'd been working on the other painting, as if my inattention had given it permission to become more real. I stepped away from the canvas, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. No, I whispered to the empty studio. No, you're not real. You're not supposed to move. Paint doesn't change. Canvas doesn't change. This isn't possible. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, looked again. The shadow had definitely moved. There was no question, no doubt, no possibility I was imagining it. I knew every line I'd drawn the night before, and this wasn't what I'd created. It had progressed, developed, become more. Then I saw something that made my blood turn to slush. The faintest movement, a flicker, a pulse, a rhythm, rippled across the shadow's chest, right where lungs would be, right where breath would move. Like it was breathing. My throat closed completely. I couldn't get air, couldn't think, couldn't process what I was seeing because it violated every law of reality I understood. I grabbed a sheet from my storage closet and threw it over the painting with shaking hands, covering it completely, hiding it from view, as if cloth could stop whatever was happening, as if I could put a barrier between me and the impossible. For a long time, I just stood there, hands trembling, sweat running down my back despite the cool studio, as if the sheet between us was the only thing keeping it from crawling out of the canvas and into the world. The second visit, at 6 p.m. exactly, rain hit the windows with a violence that felt intentional, as if the storm had been waiting all day for this specific moment to return. Each drop struck like a thrown stone, rattling the glass in its frames. At 6:01 p.m., the gallery lights flickered once, twice, 3 times. At 6:02 p.m., the bell downstairs chimed despite me being certain I'd locked the door. He was back. Not with footsteps, not with sound, not with any announcement of presence. One moment the gallery was empty. The next, he stood at the bottom of the staircase, rain untouched on his suit despite the deluge outside, hands folded neatly behind his back like a patient teacher waiting for a slow student to understand the lesson. "You've seen the first change," he said. Not a question, an acknowledgement of shared knowledge. I swallowed hard, my throat clicking. I didn't want to. Wanting and witnessing are rarely the same thing, Mr. Ward. We rarely desire the truths we're forced to see. His canvas-colored eyes drifted upward toward the sheet covering the painting in my studio above. "It is time to continue." "I don't want to continue." "You must." "Why?" The word came out as almost a shout, raw and desperate. He turned his head slightly, as though studying me like a piece of marble he was considering sculpting, evaluating my composition, my structure, my potential. "Because unfinished futures rot." I blinked, confused. "What?" He stepped closer, each movement as smooth as ink flowing across water, his feet still making no sound on the wooden stairs as he ascended toward me. "An unfinished painting," he said gently, almost kindly, "is harmless. Incomplete art simply sits, waits, remains potential rather than realized." He paused at the top step, closer now than I wanted him to be. "But an unfinished fate?" His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "An incomplete future? That is something the universe cannot allow. Nature abhors a vacuum, Mr. Ward. Time abhors an uncompleted destiny. When a fate begins to manifest but isn't allowed to complete, it begins to corrupt, to decay, to become something twisted and wrong." I backed up until my spine hit the wall, pictures rattling in their frames. "This isn't fate," I whispered. "This is insane." "No," he corrected, still approaching with that liquid, smooth movement. "This is your gift, Elias. You saw your own future. You painted it into being. And now it must be completed, or the thing you've created will complete itself without your guidance. And I assure you, you won't like what it becomes when left unsupervised." Then he reached for the sheet covering the painting. I grabbed his wrist, or tried to, but my fingers passed straight through him as if he were mist held together by will alone, offering no more resistance than smoke or shadow. The sheet dropped to the floor in a puddle of white fabric, and I froze, unable to breathe, unable to move, unable to do anything but stare. The painting was no longer just a painting. The background had darkened significantly since that morning. Not from pigment. I hadn't touched it. This was something else. The darkness looked deeper now, more dimensional, as if the space behind the figures wasn't flat canvas anymore, but actual depth, actual distance, an actual place. The air behind the figures now looked like a hallway, a passage, a tunnel stretching into infinity, into darkness, so complete it seemed to pull at the eye, to draw attention and focus down into its depths where something vast might be waiting. As if the canvas was becoming a doorway between two worlds. The man in the portrait looked exactly the same. I'd captured him perfectly in those initial strokes, and he remained unchanged, static, as portraits should be. But the version of me, the shadow figure wearing my eyes, had moved again, significantly. Its face had sharpened, gained definition and detail I absolutely hadn't painted. The smile was wider now, showing teeth that I somehow knew were mine, arranged in my exact pattern of slight crookedness on the left side. The eyes darker, more focused, more present. The body leaning slightly forward as though pushing against the limit of the frame, testing the boundary between painted world and real one. One hand, my hand, was raised now, fingers splayed against the canvas from behind, pressing outward. I could see the slight distortion of the fabric, the way it bulged ever so slightly under pressure from something that shouldn't exist. I didn't paint that, I whispered, my voice raw and broken. I didn't add any of that. I haven't touched the canvas since last night. You did, he said calmly, maddeningly patient. You paint what comes. You paint what you become. The canvas simply reveals what you've already set in motion. I shook my head violently, denial and terror mixing into something that tasted like bile. That thing is not me. The man, the thing wearing human shape, tilted his head in that wrong way. Not yet. I won't finish it. The words came out fierce, desperate, the last stand of someone with no options. You will. I refuse. You don't understand the nature of reflections, he said softly, stepping so close I could feel that strange absence smell, that scent of nothing that somehow took up space. Paintings are not pictures of who you are. They are windows into who you are becoming, prophecies made manifest, destinies given form. And windows, Mr. Ward, must open. Destinies must be fulfilled. You've already started this. Now you have to see it through. He reached into his coat, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to pull out a weapon, a knife, a gun, something to force my compliance through violence. But instead, he withdrew a paintbrush, my paintbrush, the one I'd used last night. Freshly cleaned, bristles perfect, handle smooth and familiar in a way that made my heart ache with longing for simpler times when brushes were just tools and paintings were just art. I took the liberty, he said, holding it out to me, of preparing it for you. Everything is ready. The midnight hour approaches, and you have work to do. I stared at the brush, at my hand, at the painting behind him that was becoming something no painting should ever be. You can't make me paint. I don't need to. He placed the brush gently in my hand, and despite my resistance, my fingers closed around it automatically, muscle memory taking over, the familiar weight settling into my palm like coming home. You will paint, he said quietly, with absolute certainty, because if you don't, the version of you in that canvas will finish itself. And when it does, when it completes its becoming, it will step out of that frame and take your place in this world. Your life, your name, your face, your future. Everything you are will be its. And you? He leaned close enough that I could see myself reflected in those blank canvas eyes. You will take its place, inside the painting, forever. Trapped in paint and pigment and fabric, conscious but imprisoned, screaming but silent, alive but not living. For eternity. The room grew colder, much colder. Cold enough that frost began forming on the windows, fractal patterns spreading across glass like searching fingers. I turned to look at the canvas. I couldn't help it, couldn't stop myself from confirming the horror. The canvas was bulging outward more noticeably now, like something inside was pressing harder, testing the strength of the barrier, learning its weaknesses. I stumbled backward, my hip hitting the edge of my work table hard enough to bruise. No, please, I don't want this. The surface rippled. Once, twice, like the skin of a drum being tapped from inside, the fabric responding to pressure from behind that shouldn't be able to exist. The shadow's smile widened even more, stretching past human limits now, becoming something else. Something that wore my face but wasn't me, could never be me, refused to be bound by what I was. And then, so clear it couldn't be denied or dismissed or explained away, I heard it. A voice. My voice. But not quite. Lower, darker, hungrier. Whispered from inside the canvas like a secret shared between lovers or conspirators. Finish me. The brush felt heavy in my hand. Heavier than it should. As if it were made of lead or stone or the weight of impossible choices. I looked at the man, the thing, standing in my studio, watching me with patient, inevitable certainty. What happens if I finish it? My voice shook, cracked, barely worked. You become, he said simply. The question is, will you guide that becoming, or will you let it guide you? The canvas rippled again, more violently. The frame creaked, wood groaning under stress it wasn't designed to bear. Finish me, Elias, the voice said again, louder now, more insistent, more real. Let me out. My hand trembled, the brush shook. Every instinct screamed to run, to burn the painting, to destroy it before it destroyed me. But deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew the truth. I'd already made my choice the moment I'd accepted this commission. The moment I'd drawn the first line. The moment I'd seen the symbol from my nightmares and said yes anyway. Some doors, once opened, don't close. Some paintings, once started, demand completion. Some futures, once glimpsed, become inevitable. I stepped toward the canvas, brush in hand, terror and resignation warring in my chest. The shadow me smiled wider, its eyes, my eyes, gleaming with triumph and hunger and something that might have been recognition. Good, the man whispered behind me. Very good. Now paint what you see, paint what you're becoming, and pray that what emerges is something you can live with. I raised the brush to the canvas, my hand steadier now, guided by something beyond fear or choice, and I began to paint. The moment bristles touched fabric, the temperature plummeted further. The lights dimmed to almost nothing, and somewhere in the darkness between one brushstroke and the next, I felt it. The shift, the change, the becoming. I was no longer alone in my body. Something else was there too, watching through my eyes, guiding my hand, painting with me and through me and as me. The shadow in the canvas began to gain color, to fill out, to become more real with every stroke I made. And with each moment of its increasing solidity, I felt myself becoming less, lighter, thinner, as if I were being transferred stroke by stroke from the real world into the painted one. That's it, the man encouraged softly. Just let it happen. Let the transformation complete. One Elias ends, another begins. The wheel turns. The cycle continues, as it always has. As it always must. Hours passed, or maybe minutes or days, I couldn't tell anymore. Time had become fluid, meaningless, just another boundary dissolving between what was real and what was painted. I added detail after detail to the shadow figure, watching it solidify, watching it become. Its features sharpening into perfect clarity, its body gaining weight and presence, its expression shifting from hunger to satisfaction to something like joy. And all the while, I felt myself fading, my substance draining away like color washed from fabric, my presence in the real world becoming gossamer thin, barely there, just another shadow cast by insufficient light. Finally, after an eternity that might have been 4 hours or 4 minutes, I added the last stroke, the final detail, the completing touch that made the painting whole, and the shadow me was no longer a shadow. It was complete, perfect, fully realized. As real as any painted thing could be, and then somehow more than that, somehow actually real in a way that transcended medium and technique. Its eyes opened fully, my eyes, perfectly replicated down to the last fleck of color, and looked directly at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then it smiled, not the hungry smile from before, something else, something almost kind. Thank you, it said in my voice, perfectly replicated. I'll take good care of your life, I promise. And it stepped forward, pressing against the canvas from behind. The fabric stretched impossibly, bulging outward, creating a bubble of distorted space. Then it tore. Not violently, not with sound or drama. It simply opened, like a curtain drawn back, like a door swinging wide. And the thing wearing my face, the perfected version, the completed future, the me that was always meant to be, stepped through into the real world. It looked exactly like me, moved like me, breathed like me, was me in every measurable way, except it wasn't. Not really. I could see it in the eyes, something vast and dark and patient looking out from behind familiar features, something that had been waiting a very long time for this moment. It turned to the man, the patron, the guide, the thing that had orchestrated all of this. "It's done," it said in my voice. "So it is," he replied with satisfaction. "Another cycle complete, another transformation finished, another artist fulfills his purpose." They both turned to look at me, and I realized with growing horror that I could no longer feel the floor beneath my feet, couldn't feel the brush in my hand, couldn't feel anything except a terrible lightness, a dissolution, a sense of becoming something less than solid. I looked down at myself and saw that I was fading, becoming translucent, turning into the ghost they'd warned me about. "No," I whispered, though the sound barely carried. "No, please, you said if I finished it." "I said you had to complete the painting," the man corrected gently. "And you did, but I never said which version of you would remain when it was done. The painting always gets completed, Mr. Ward. The only question was whether you'd be the one to do it, or whether your replacement would. You chose to do it yourself. That was kind of you." It made the transition smoother for everyone involved. The thing wearing my face, the perfect me, the complete me, the me without doubt or fear or weakness, reached out and took the brush from my fading fingers. "I'll be you better than you ever were," it said, not unkindly. "I'll live the life you were always too afraid to live. I'll create the art you were always too timid to attempt. I'll be everything you could have been if you'd only been brave enough." "Please," I begged, my voice barely a whisper now. "Please don't do this." But they weren't listening anymore. The man and my replacement were already leaving, walking toward the stairs, discussing something in low tones about the next project, the next artist, the next transformation. And I was floating now, drifting backward, pulled by invisible currents toward the torn canvas that hung like an open mouth waiting to swallow me. I tried to resist, to fight, to scream. But I was too insubstantial now, too faded, too much like paint and shadow and nothing at all. The last thing I saw before the canvas pulled me in completely was my replacement, turning back to look at me one final time. It smiled, my smile, but better, more confident, more real. "Thank you for the life," it said. Then darkness took me, and I fell backward into the painted world, into the canvas, into the prison of pigment and fabric where I would remain forever. Conscious but silent, alive but not living, trapped in the painting that showed who I would become and who I would cease to be. Final chapter, the silence inside the canvas. I expected oblivion. When the canvas swallowed me, when its torn mouth closed around me like wet cloth tightening over drowning skin, I thought there would be nothing. No light, no sound, no sense of self, just the end. But the truth was worse. I didn't lose consciousness. I didn't dissolve. I didn't die. I hung, suspended in a world that felt painted but wasn't. Not exactly. Imagine being trapped beneath ice so thick you can't see the surface, yet so thin you can hear footsteps above you. Imagine screaming with all the force your lungs can muster, only to realize you no longer have lungs, only awareness, only vision. Only the taste of endless stillness pressing into your mind like fingers smothering a flame. That was the canvas. A place where color was sound, light was pressure, and the absence of breath was the first rule of the world. I didn't know how long I hung there. Time didn't behave normally. It wasn't hours or minutes. It was strokes, brush strokes. The canvas pulsed in rhythms like a heart that beat only when touched by real hands. And outside those pulses, silence. Thick, crushing, complete. I thought I was alone in that void. I was wrong. The others. They were shapes at first, blurred outlines drifting behind layers of pigment, smears of color, faces half-formed, as though someone had started them and abandoned the work. In the darkness between strokes, I felt them watching me. They whispered sometimes, soft, dry sounds like bristles dragged across sandpaper. The others, they were shapes at first, blurred outlines drifting behind layers of pigment, smears of color, faces half-formed as though someone had started them and abandoned the work. In the darkness between strokes, I felt them watching me. They whispered sometimes, soft, dry sounds like bristles dragged across sandpaper. Lost, forgotten, unfinished. I didn't understand what they were, but I felt what they were. Portraits. Portraits of people who had once lived. People who had once painted their own fates. People who had been replaced like me. I drifted among them in a space that wasn't space, through layers of paint that weren't paint, hearing their unfinished words dissolve like turpentine on old pigment. But one voice rose above the rest. A woman's. Clear, sharp, close. You're not supposed to be here. The painted dark shifted. A ripple passed through the layers like fabric stirred by an unseen hand, and she stepped forward. Her face was half real, half brushed away. One eye detailed enough to be human, the other only a charcoal outline. Her hair was strokes of burnt umber and raw sienna. Her mouth flickered between open and closed as if the artist never decided. "You replaced?" she asked. My voice didn't work here. I had no throat, but the canvas carried intention like sound. "Yes," she nodded. "Thought so. You still have boundaries, still have edges. You're new." "Where am I?" The question trembled through the space in a ripple of color. She reached behind her ear, and her fingertip disappeared into raw canvas. When it emerged again, it was dripping with linseed oil that smelled like memory. "You're in the underpainting." I didn't understand. My confusion rippled gold. She gestured calmly. "The space beneath the visible world, the first layer, before detail, before form. Everything that will ever be starts here." Then she leaned close, her half-painted eye full of a sorrow older than its pigments, "And everything that will ever be forgotten ends here." Behind her, the other figures froze, half-faces, stroked torsos, abandoned commissions. "Everyone here failed to complete their becoming," she whispered. "Everyone here was replaced." The pressure around me thickened. Another pulse. Another brushstroke from the outside world. Another distant echo of life I no longer had. "But you," she continued, studying my still solid edges, "you have something different. You're not fading." "I'm trapped." The words trembled like spilled ink. "No," she said, "you are changing." The first shift, I didn't feel my hand until it wasn't mine anymore. It extended reflexively. Too fluid, too long, too flexible. Pigment stretched like tendons, lines sharpened. The background wrapped around my wrist like a living shadow. I tried to pull back. I couldn't. "Don't fight it," she said. "You'll tear your layers." "What's happening to me?" Her half-face softened. "You're becoming one of us." A wave of despair hit me so hard the canvas shivered. No, I can't." "You don't have a choice," she said calmly. "Your replacement walks your world now. You walk this one." "But I'm still me." "You won't be for long." There was no cruelty in her tone, only truth. "You're already slowing," she added quietly. "Soon you'll harden, fix, set." I looked down. The parts of me closest to the painted world, my fingertips, my forearms, my legs, were losing depth, losing dimension, becoming strokes instead of flesh. I tried to scream, but the canvas stole sound before it formed. The woman reached toward my face. "You need to understand this before you're gone." Her painted fingers pressed into my forehead, and my vision broke open into 100 layers. The origin images, brushes older than history, hands older than bodies, eyes that were not eyes painting the first humans into existence. A circle of beings, tall, pale, canvas-skinned, standing around a void that was not yet a world. They painted humanity, layer by layer, color by color, bone by bone. Creation was art. Art was prophecy. Prophecy was control. And the beings who painted the first humans? They never left. They hid among us, commissioning portraits, choosing replacements, refreshing the design of humanity like artists replacing flawed drafts. Each cycle produced a new version of someone, sharper, stronger, more compliant, more aligned with their design. The unfinished humans, the rejected drafts, they went here, to the underpainting, to wait forever as ghosts trapped beneath the final image. The patron. When the vision ended, the woman spoke softly. "That man who came to you, the one with skin like canvas?" I didn't respond. I didn't need to. He was one of them, a painter, one of the originals. Her half-finished mouth curled downward. "They use artists like you because you blur the boundaries. You see truth. You channel it. You open doors they cannot open alone." She stepped back into the murk, sadness radiating. "You weren't chosen to paint him." My painted heart froze. "You were chosen to paint your successor." The truth of replacement. My thoughts splintered. All those strokes, every line I'd drawn, every detail I'd sharpened, every correction I'd made, hadn't been shaping him. They had been shaping the better version of me, a version the originals wanted, a version who would obey, a version who would influence humanity in the direction they desired. He hadn't stolen my life. I had built his, and now the canvas tightened around me like a closing fist, the drafts. The other lost ones moved closer now, drifting like forgotten memories. Some were children, some elderly, some whole, except for missing features, eyes never finished, mouths unpainted, hands erased. All of them watched me. All of them knew. You'll harden soon, the woman whispered. You'll forget your name first, then your face, then everything else. No, I projected. I won't let it happen. You don't control it. I have to try. Her half-face tilted with pity. There is only one way to escape the underpainting. How? Desperation shimmered through my form. She leaned in until her unfinished eye filled my vision. You must replace someone. The canvas world pulsed. You must take a body in the real world, tear your way through, inhabit it, push the living soul out. My painted form recoiled. I won't do that. You will, she whispered. Everyone does, eventually. The silence breaks you, the stillness starves you, the brushstrokes crush you. One day soon, you will beg for any form of release. I'm not like them. You will be. The underpainting around us throbbed with cold color. The others whispered, join us. Join. Join. I felt the first crack in my identity, a fracture where memory began to leak out like pigment thinning with solvent. My childhood, my mother's voice, my old self-portrait, my name, they dimmed, they slipped, they vanished. No, no. No, the woman caught my fading wrist. Listen carefully, she said urgently. When you break, when you lose yourself, you'll still get one chance. What chance? To choose who you replace. My form flickered wildly. You can take someone innocent, she said, or someone already claimed by the originals, someone they're preparing as a vessel. She squeezed my dissolving fingers. If you choose wisely, you might break the cycle. How? You'll know when the time comes. My vision blurred, my body evaporating, my identity dissolving, the underpainting consuming, the original paintmaster reshaping, and through the last hole in my fading consciousness, I saw him, my replacement, living my life, breathing my air, smiling my smile, using my hands, standing in my studio, speaking to someone just out of frame. Then he turned, looked straight at the painting, straight at me, and whispered, "Are you watching, Elias?" My fading mind screamed, "Yes," he smiled wider. "Good, I want you to see what I'm about to do." Then he blew out the studio's candles. Darkness swallowed both worlds, and I began to forget my name, my life, my world, my edges, my layers, my purpose, everything. Until only one thing remained, a single word, a single instinct, a single need: replace. A Shadow Prophet I Deep Lore Summary. This is not a story about art. Not really. It's a story about identity, about fate, creation, and the oldest kind of magic, the magic of shape, of reflection, and of becoming. It begins with a painter, a simple man named Elias Ward, whose only sin was seeing too deeply into the souls of those he painted, a gift that made him successful, but also made him visible to the wrong eyes. They're thin, the beginning of the end. Elias was a portrait artist with an extraordinary talent. He could paint people the way they truly were, not just their appearance, but their essence, their fears, their secrets, the shape of what they might become. Most clients loved this. Some said his portraits changed their lives. None understood the truth. Elias wasn't painting faces. He was painting futures. One rainy November evening, a man walked into his studio. A man who shouldn't exist. Tall, pale, eyes the exact shade of raw canvas, blank, waiting to be written upon. He carried a symbol from Elias's childhood nightmares, a spiral around an eye, encased in ancient geometry, drawn in ink older than history. He commissioned a portrait. At midnight, the moment Elias touched charcoal to canvas, something in the room changed. Air froze, lights dimmed, a hum vibrated beneath the floorboards, and Elias began to see beneath the man's human surface. What he saw in the shadows behind the man was a second figure, not a stranger, not an intruder. It was himself, or rather, a version of him that did not yet exist. The shadow self. The thing behind the patron was tall, indistinct, ghost-like, but the eyes were undeniable. His eyes. Exact, precise, but filled with hunger, knowing, and a kind of cruel serenity. Elias denied drawing it. The man insisted he had. You paint what you see, and what you will become. That night, after the patron left, the shadow self smiled. Elias hadn't painted that smile. It appeared on its own. The painting was alive, and it was waiting. The canvas that breathed. The next morning, the shadow figure had moved, just slightly, but enough to prove the impossible was happening. It was gaining definition, becoming solid, awakening. Later that evening, the patron returned and told Elias the truth. Unfinished futures rot. An incomplete destiny must complete itself. If you do not finish the painting, the one inside it will. The meaning was clear. If Elias refused to complete the portrait, the shadow self would finish itself and take his place in reality, and Elias would take its place inside the canvas forever. The man then handed Elias his own paintbrush, freshly cleaned, and left him no choice. At midnight, Elias began to paint again. The canvas began to breathe. For hours he painted with a presence inside him, a consciousness guiding his hand, a hunger tightening his thoughts. He felt himself fading, stroke by stroke, as the shadow self grew sharper, clearer, stronger. The second visit, and the woman in the dark. The next day someone else appeared in Elias's studio. Not the man, a woman. Her presence was colder, sharper, her silhouette wrong in ways Elias couldn't describe. Her name was Mara. She told him the truth the patron never would. Elias had been chosen not because of talent, but because of lineage, a bloodline sensitive to the shapes behind the world. She explained that the first artists weren't human. That creation itself began with beings who painted the first humans into existence. They created, shaped, refined, and replaced, and they never left. They still walk the world, choosing artists with the gift to see truth beneath the skin. Artists like Elias. He wasn't painting the patron. He wasn't painting a client. He was painting a successor, a version of himself designed by ancient beings to be more efficient, more controlled, more obedient. Once completed, that version would replace him, and he would become nothing more than a draft, an unfinished sketch, a rejected stroke, a ghost in the underpainting. Mara warned him, "You have 3 nights, 3 strokes of destiny, 3 chances to guide who you become." But Elias painted anyway, because he had no choice. The replacement. On the final night, the shadow self became whole. It stepped out of the canvas, calm, steady, complete, and walked into Elias's life. It thanked him. "Thank you for the life you built for me. I'll live it better than you ever could." Then the patron led the new version of Elias away, discussing future projects, future replacements, future cycles. Elias tried to scream, but he had no throat, he had no body, he had no world. The underpainting, where all drafts go. Elias fell backward into the canvas world, a space beneath reality, the underpainting. It was a liminal dimension filled with shapes, half-faces, abandoned portraits, failed souls, unfinished humans, all drifting in silence, all aware, all trapped. A woman with a half-painted face approached him. She explained the underpainting. Everything that will ever exist begins as a sketch. Everything that is replaced ends here. Every person the originals had erased, every life overwritten, was imprisoned here forever. Elias began to fade, his edges blurring, his form dissolving. He was becoming a painting, a silent reflection, a frozen draft. But before he lost himself completely, the woman gave him one last truth. There is only one way to escape the underpainting. How? You must replace someone. You must choose a body in the real world, push its soul out, take its place. Elias recoiled. "I won't. You will. When the silence breaks you, when the stillness devours you, when the canvas erases your name, you will beg to escape." He refused, but refusal meant nothing. He began to forget his mother's voice, his studio, his own face, his own name, until only one thought remained: replace. The moment of truth. As Elias faded into painted shadow, he saw one last vision, his replacement, standing in his studio, living his life, painting new works with impossible skill, smiling his smile, speaking to people who believed they were speaking to Elias. But the replacement looked directly at the painting, directly at Elias within it, and whispered, "Are you watching?" Elias answered, "Yes." The replacement grinned. "Good, I want you to see what I'm about to do." Then he blew out the candles. Darkness swallowed the studio. Darkness swallowed the underpainting. Elias's last thought before his identity cracked completely was a single word: replace. Word summary. Themes and impact. You can keep this in your description too. This story is about identity versus reflection, creation versus control, art as prophecy, humanity as a design, not a birth, replacements walking among us, a man fighting his own future. The horror of becoming obsolete. It asks, What if the best version of you isn't you at all? What if someone else designs your destiny? What if your reflection wants your life more than you do? This horror isn't supernatural. It's existential. It attacks the most fragile human truth. I am myself. Because in this world, in the Shadow Prophet I universe, even that is not guaranteed.